So yeah, I wonder, I will open it up like I did last time to hear if people have thoughts either about any of the things that were mentioned in the podcast or about what I just said, the general theme of striking a balance between how you teach ethics in terms of focusing on the more technical components of, embedding ethics within the actual work of computer scientists versus the teaching more, you know, uh, hardcore ethics, so to speak, right? Philosophical, moral theory, etc. So I will just curious to hear your thoughts.
I'm waiting on Jason.
I'm happy
Jason
to
says no.
Let Ian go. He's muted.
I'm happy to get us going. I think so. A comment first that I think is going to transition into a question for most of you all is um, I've long felt that ethics or any sort of logic philosophy training was seriously missing from K through 12 and even just the average undergraduate degree. I mean, some undergrad degrees you have to take phys ed classes, but you don't have to take any sort of reasoning class. Um, so this idea of having the ethics training built into computer science sounds great. Uh, of course, there are issues, and I don't know how to disentangle that question that Alex proposed of how do you start with the technical stuff, the applied stuff, or the background of philosophy training. Um, so as those questions start to get pulled apart, what really got me was this idea that the speakers mentioned of teaching ethics as a skill. And I think some skills are very cut and dry, like physics experiments, chemistry, titrations. There's not much subjectivity built into those. But a skill like ethics, if we were to say teach ethics as a skill, how, as ethicists and ethics educators, could that be done in an unbiased way and a way that doesn't make it so that computer scientists or any other tangential discipline won't simply treat it in like a compliancy way where it's just a check mark that they have to consider. So I guess it's two questions. How is there an unbiased way to go about this? And then question number two is um, how do we stop this from being just compliance?
Yeah, I love that point, Ian. Compliance is often the way it's enforced in corporations today, with privacy and security regulations often being the only safeguards of ethics. And in education, though, yeah, how do you teach it in an unbiased way? Um, I think like when I think of ethics, I think in the purpose of learning it, it's to avoid harm on humans or the environment, or especially like undue harm or unnecessary harm, especially like unintentional, perhaps. And when I reflect on my own computer science undergrad and the one ethics course we did at engineering ethics, it was all of engineering. So industrial, mechanical, chemical, computer, and so very broad. And in fact, I think not useful enough because our disciplines have unique ethical problems. Like you said, the kind of the subjectivity is interesting there. The only case study I remember from the class was just about the Challenger explosion, which maybe is just more of a case study on a failure to communicate, not necessarily on a lack of ethics. And so I think what I'd like to see in computer science education are the professors of computer science, especially talking about real examples. I still think case studies are the best way to kind of see firsthand the harm that could be done from technology, especially I think coming from someone of authority in my own field. If Dr. Beaver came to my AI machine learning class and kind of just started ranting about AI's impact on the environment, I may not even want to listen just because you're in the out group, right? And so I valued the podcast. I only got to listen for a little bit, but that first thing of the courses should, and those instructors should be trained to talk about it. I would think the best way would be from personal, like from a storytelling experience of ways in which a lack of using this skill caused harm. I think most folks don't want to cause harm and just don't know that the things we do cause harm. So I think the common one in AI is that the lack of training data on like black and brown faces makes like algorithms unable to identify like people of color, or to negatively bias against them, right? This was unintentional, and it's actually more of a problem of the organizations not recruiting diversely enough, for example, not necessarily an ethical lack of judgment per se. You don't know what you don't know. And that's really the key thing here that I would love to maybe talk about more is how can engineers know what they don't know? How do you go about problems when you're not even sure of an unintended side effect of the technology you make? The best we can do is to encourage like curiosity and experimentation and just thinking of all of the ways things can fail, and to also realize that you don't know everything and to seek expert guidance, especially from people perhaps that have already done it. I haven't taken an AI class in a while, but I would hope that today's classes are talking about the failures of using biased training data and how important it is to get unbiased data. That's like an easy win, I think, today. And I'd be interested to see how well they're doing that today. I'll leave it at that. I have more thoughts, but yeah, I think to summarize, you can be unbiased. I think people's lived experiences with ethical issues resounds with others, and that students should hear it from people that matter to them, that maybe are in the roles that they want to work in, for example, actual real cases in their field, not in another field or too abstract of a concept that is too esoteric to understand.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question, Jason?
Mm-hmm.
When you say it's about expertise and that the ethicist might be in the out group, you want it to come from people in the in group, which would be better for this discussion to come from a professor or this discussion to come from a guest speaker from industry?
Yeah, I think either could work. I think it depends on the. I think industry. This would be a great experiment, honestly. I could see two conditions there, but especially computer scientists, we idolize tech companies. They are our dreams. They are geniuses. We want to be them. We will do almost anything to be like them. Like it in the computer science, like the idolatry of big tech is outstanding.
Sounds like a great movie script.
And so I do think what's hard is like there's lots of unknown faces in tech, and the folks that actually do work on ethics, like at Microsoft, the responsible AI group is a thing. If they came in and talked about how they apply ethics at Microsoft, that's almost it's still just as bad because it's a department focused on ethics. It's not a software engineer that I can see myself acting as, right? So it's important, I think, for a student to like visualize, oh, that's a person work using the skills and tasks that I want to use, and how they go about problems, or their words of wisdom, or I should say cautionary tales, I think are really valuable. And so the storytelling part, I think most useful. So yeah, if we can find big tech folks outside to come in, that'd be great. But I think professors also have even industry experience before as well. That would be sufficient. So I think both approaches would be worth using.
Jason, I hate to put you on the spot, but as our designated computer science person, I feel compelled. So I love that point about the insider perspective. And one thing that the speaker on the podcast was talking about, the insider perspective, also talked about command of the language. So it's really easy when you have someone come into class to understand that they're not an insider because they don't even speak your language, so to speak. So I'm curious, what would that look like in terms of, like a speaker who actually talks about ethics and talks about them in a way that a computer scientist might talk about them, as opposed to just a philosopher who kind of, comes in from the armchair and thinks about all these big concepts with a very layperson understanding of how computers work and how AI works. Like I'm thinking, if you have any examples of anything.
Yeah, the language, to me, it's not necessarily so much the language as it is um, the context. So what I mean by that is, um, if an outside guest came in, like, and they are, let's say, the principal AI engineer at Meta or something like this. That's exciting for me because maybe that's if I was a young CS student, I can, and if I heard this person tell me, especially like a person of authority and experience, that using language like, yeah, every day we need to think about how to develop. When we think about like new projects, we are thinking about ethics in this way. Or maybe not even using the word ethics, but like it's equally as important to get the technology right as it is to um, build safe systems, right? Um, what is a safe system? So I think like safety is pretty resounding, I think universally. And that's why I kind of introed like ethics to me is about avoiding harm foremost. And so I think safety is a really like tangible concept for computer science students, um, that is harped a lot in other like structural engineering, for example, like the actual safety of buildings. But like algorithmic safety, what does that mean? Having someone explain what that means to create safe algorithms, or how they try to ensure safety in that level would be important. So I think that language is important, and um, so to use language that they would understand and resound with them. I think, I would actually welcome Dr. Beaver coming to a CS class, and Dr. Kubler too. I know I went to a workshop of Dr. Kubler's and about like research ethics, right? Um, we're in different fields of expertise, but I still respected what he had to say, and I learned something. And so it wasn't necessary, but the difference is Dr. Kubler is faculty here. I aspire to be that. So actually what you had to say had more credence because you already had a bunch of checks in my boxes of someone that has expertise. So maybe again, that's supporting my viewpoint that having people that you aspire to be or have the traits that you aspire to have, are the best to learn from the correct behaviors, because you're trying to model your behaviors after them, in some way. So That's my thought.
To push it a little bit higher for a second. I have in the back of my head this tension, right? So on one hand, we want folks to whom, Jason, you can aspire, and I'm sure that's true for all of us. So they've got to be in our area, but they also have to have a relevant set of not only experience, but relevant expertise, because it's not like any computer scientist, I would wager, could come in and talk about ethics in any sort of framed, coherent way. You know, everybody could tell stories, but to frame those stories in a specific way, which is the point of storytelling, takes a specific kind of skill. And in my experience, a lot of my computer science colleagues aren't given the time as faculty, and then therefore they don't give the time to their students to develop those skills. And I wondered, Ian, in your case as a biologist, and then Josh and Alex and me too as philosophers, like, are there parallels? Is it the case that philosophers aren't given the time to develop, say, relevant levels of expertise in computer science to be able to have those conversations? Or Ian, in your case, do biologists think enough about ethics to be able to step into a class and say, or to mentor students and be like, here's how to act ethically as a biologist, right? What's the role of expertise?
Yeah, I think that's really gets to the one question I had about how do you avoid this becoming just a matter of compliance. And from my experience, most of my colleagues consider what they have to consider to meet check marks. So whether they're getting IRB approvals or IACUC for animal studies, they're thinking to themselves when they're filling out that form, what is the wording I need to put on this document to trigger the least amount of red flags? It's not necessarily it's not necessarily the other side of it where they could be asking themselves, what is the most ethical way to do this? They're asking themselves, how do I avoid suspicion? So I think to answer your question, there isn't a lot of formal training or informal training in most cases on how to have those conversations. Instead, it's how do we make it look as neat as possible, whether it's like an NSF application and you're trying to hit check marks on a broader impact section, or like I said, IACUC forms. It's usually more training on the actual logistic than the intellectual navigation. There, of course, are exceptions. I was lucky to have an advisor at UCF who, we actually did talk philosophy. So I think there are exceptions, but the rule is most people, either because they don't care or they don't have the time to have that training, it's just not there.
I think this is interesting, Ian, also because it kind of brings back to your point about like teaching ethics as a skill or being an ethical engineer as an embodied skill that really reshapes your everyday life as a scientist in any field, really. And that almost seems like we need to reevaluate the whole way, the whole curriculum that we think about exposing students to, so that ethics is really truly embedded and it's not this standalone course, which is why I also find myself, I really appreciate ethical theory. I think it's very important, and I do think it's very relevant, and students learn to see the relevance and to appreciate it, even when they're not philosophers. But it feels like it needs to be a bit disguised almost when it's presented, so that it's more easy to kind of embed within the actual coursework. Because as long as it stands as this, course that's on its own, the ethics of engineering, it might always just seem like an add-on that does not directly, maybe, it's another requirement, another skill, but it always kind of seems extrinsic to the very process of doing your work as an engineer or as a biologist, or whatever that may be, which I guess makes me think of like Jonathan's point of the need to either develop more interdisciplinary departments or start training people more interdisciplinarily so that people have skills in both ethics and other fields that they're interested in, so they could actually bring these in together in the classroom in a way that truly integrates them rather than present them as, you know, after effects, right? Let's evaluate ethically something that happened and not just look at literally the processes that went in and informed the outcome, and thinking about all the ethical implications that go into each and every one of these processes, and how values, goals, all these things that kind of go into designing anything really are never made fully explicit until that very end point where you see something bad happening and you start thinking, what did we do wrong? Should we have done something, you know, to protect people? And then it feels like, again, it becomes like a cautionary, let's click on the boxes to make sure that the IRB approves it and has our back also, so nothing goes wrong. So yeah, I don't know if other people have thoughts also about this more integrative approach that Ian, it seems to me, is suggesting.
I feel like I can see inklings of that happening within, Josh, sorry, you're up next. I could see inklings of this happening even within computer science. The human computer interaction tracks within computer science departments, ours included, seem to be growing. And Jason, you can course correct me if you've got data here, but those approaches seem much more oriented to the, again, human interaction side, as opposed to the real traditional build the thing and they will come sort of approach to computer science. But again, there are very different tracks within those programs. And from an outsider's perspective, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of cross-pollination even within computer science, which is, I think, really interesting. Josh, go ahead, sorry.
I feel like my thought might take a slightly afield. So if someone has I mean, this even goes almost, I think, back to Ian's question. So right, there's the question of, is there an unbiased way to go about this? And I have thoughts to think about whether we should try to be unbiased or whether clarity about our bias is the way. But that thing, and then how do we, I think that the question that we're on now is how do we stop it from being compliance oriented? And I kind of have this thing that, like, I think it was an undergrad professor, it's just like human beings respond to incentives, and that's like an important thing to keep in mind. So like it makes sense, right, that when we have an ethics requirement, you know, the eye cook if you're doing animal experiments or whatever it is, like we're going to try and find the quickest way to resolve our problems. And it doesn't mean we will get the quickest way, but like, I think the problem seems to be, especially because all this talk about ethics in STEM or ethics in outside of the policy department in general, right? It's often implicitly we're trying to correct. We think we're not doing it well enough here, right? But it feels like if we're trying to correct something, it tends towards someone from the outside or someone we don't have an existing respect for him, with Jason's point there. And I think, I mean, I don't know, but the question is how am I able to present this is just restating the question. How am I able to present this ethics education in a way that isn't going to lead a human being to see, here's a set of incentives, things I have to respond to. And of course, I'm going to do what at least the human beings, when we're doing things well, do, is I'm going to figure out the easiest way to resolve this. And so I think, I mean, I know in my own teaching, which is teaching in philosophy departments or in a philosophy and religion department, even there, I feel like I'm masking a little bit. So I'm teaching them certain skills that for me seem connected to ethics teaching, but it feels like that's going to be ratcheted up, you know, fivefold when I'm doing ethics, which seems like outside of the discipline. And stuff. So this isn't an answer, but it's just, it feels like the task is, how am I able to overcome or somehow trick or manipulate as a negative connotation? So how am I going to do this in a way that isn't going to lead us to naturally see these as incentives or make our students see these incentives as I have to meet this requirement? And so then a bright student is going to meet those requirements in a way that maybe isn't the goal that we had in mind. I don't
know. Jason, I see you have a point that you wanted to add.
Well, I like Joshua's final thought there about incentives. Just, yeah, kind of reminds me of what Ian said about just checking the box, meeting the requirement. And yeah, I think that kind of segues into my point that especially in computer science and building fast, as fast as you can, hacking, the hack culture, just get something that works is the number one priority, like always. And culturally speaking, I should say. Um, the methods, there's no waterfall methods where it's a long planning process in the front with requirements and you go through phases, is archaic now. It's all about agile and scrum style. It's very quick iterations, just try to get a minimally viable product. And that's the problem with the definition of minimally viable product in startup cultures too, is just something that's usable. I rarely see any discussion about something that's usable but still safe to use. Um, it's about functionality and not about ethical or the broader impacts of it. It's like proving you have viability, right? And I'm not sure if this is maybe unique only to computer science. I mean, startups are not just tech companies. There's many types of this where they do similar things, but there are so many tech startups, and even within big tech companies that are no longer startups, this culture you'll find it there as well. But thankfully, at big companies, like especially at Microsoft, they have now lots of muscle of reviews for accessibility, and AI. Like I said, the responsible AI group now. There's much more requirements there, and privacy and security policies. So, as I think, there's no way for us to ensure that every computer science student, if they are presented with an ethical dilemma, will make the right choice. Like, I don't think we'll ever guarantee that, right? So I think we have the best we could do is to have policies and checkboxes to encourage the correct behaviors at the right times, early in the process, allowing it to slow down, to do the right thing. Those sorts of values I wish were more idolized than just make something that works without much consideration for anything else. And so I do think it's still okay to have these minimum policies, even in a classroom. Some students will get it, some will not, but they can't say they weren't exposed to the importance of it, at least.
Yeah, I think I'm fully in agreement with that and with the point about incentives that Josh raised, and it makes me think also back to one of the speakers who talked about things that should never be built, right? There seems to be a need to produce something that has not been produced, because that's the way to distinguish yourself, right? And that's the way to get in a market. And sometimes all you need is a big enough market to buy an app to make money or sell your company or whatever. And just because there's a market for something doesn't mean that that thing should be produced, right? And it doesn't seem that much thought goes into that. And I was thinking about some of the examples that that speaker was showing, which I was really astounded that there's a crime detection, criminal, like it's a facial app, facial recognition that tells you whether someone has a propensity for criminality, basically. So it's kind of like a craniotomy, or, these like old eugenics related theories that are completely antiquated and racist, and yet people build apps based on that. And sure, some people will download those apps and use them and maybe even purchase them if they cost money. And then, you wonder why it never crossed the mind of the people developing those apps, that these are like intrinsically from their very design, like they shouldn't be there, right? And it's not a matter of I'm value neutral, I'm providing something that, you know, some people might want to use, some people don't. I don't pass judgment on it, right? Like there needs to be judgment passed on certain products and what their utility is. And so this almost kind of is at the very start of the design process, right? Because every new technology enables you to do certain things, not all of which are necessarily things we should be doing as a society. And so one wonders why that is often considered an impediment to scientific growth or advancement, rather than kind of like, you know, a given, right? It seems that almost in every other aspect of everyday life, people don't just do things because they can do them, right? So why are we just doing things because they can do them in that area without trying to see, you know, or foresee negative consequences? Especially when the things we're working on are so powerful and really can have like foreseeable or unforeseeable consequences that are much worse than, you know, doing something in your daily life can impact people. So I think that's just really, really interesting how this, like you described it, the hack culture, right? Do things, do fast, don't think about it, and kind of like how it intermingles with these capitalist incentives to just stand out, create a product. So how do we start, you know, bringing in these values in a way and how they are embedded not only in computer science specifically, but in the way we approach science so that we talk about them openly and talk about their ethical implications. And yeah, I don't know what the best way to do that, I guess, is, but I think that's something that's very crucial that we need to do. And another thing I just want to mention, because I was curious about what you think as well, was and this was Jason in one of the latest set of comments that you made, that not everyone, you know, will be influenced by what we teach them. And I was thinking about that. Well, it was not a statistic that's universal. It was for the classes that that professor was teaching. But he said that 20% of students, I think he called them the tricky 20% or something like that, are really hard to convince that ethics is important. There's some people who are already, you know, they've bought in, they know it from before they get into the class. Then there's a group of students who kind of see the relevance but need a bit pushing. And then there's some people who are just, no, this is just placing unnecessary constraints. I don't see the reason. It's not our job. And so I'm also curious to hear what the rest of you think in terms of our obligation as educators to reach out to those students as well, and not just the majority of the class who are already, you know, coming in with these values into the classroom that make them more likely to find these ethical conversations agreeable.
Steve, I see your hand. Go for it.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Well, I wonder about that 20%. That was lingering in the back of my mind when I raised my hand, because I wonder if that 20% will never be moved, or if that 20% is perhaps societally conditioned, in the sense that if we don't create space and time to consider ethics issues, and if we don't prioritize it, then of course you're going to have that 20% or maybe greater that says, hang on, what's going to be on the test? Why am I studying this ethics stuff? Right? And that's really the zeitgeist of education right now. What's going to be on the test, and what is the relevance to my career advancement? And I'm not in computer science industry, but I'm a user of software. And what I see on the software side is that everything Jason said is, you know, absolutely spot on. Get it to work, get it out there, and don't consider other things. And perhaps the best example of that is that software, I think, is one of the few products where it is developed and beta tested on the consumer, right? You roll out beta products, you roll out patches, you constantly update it. Now, to be fair, some patches are done more often now, because of hacking, right? And so it's an active war out there. But long prior to that, we had highly unstable versions of the most ubiquitous operating system, and it was constantly being patched to fix what was a hack, basically. If you did that with motor vehicles, you'd be sued. You have to safety test a motor vehicle well. I think the same idea could be applied to pharmaceutical industry. It's kind of interesting there because we have an FDA and you have to go through lots of review. But once a medication is out there, doctors are free to prescribe it pretty much any way they want, even for non-list maladies, and then can do research and write papers on that effectively. Not necessarily even completely under IRB approval. It's interesting how that industry works. So we do have in our society a push to get her done, and not necessarily a push to think about ethical implications. And the pressure of economics rolls down to the level of the student. I got to come in, I got to get a job, I got to get through college. Is this going to be on the test? What's it going to take to get there? Does that allow any space for discussion of ethics? And part of the challenge is the economics of it. The economics is the price tag, the opportunity cost, I would say. You have, there's a high opportunity cost to spending time focusing on things that don't lead to immediate career advancement. So you're predisposed to not care so much about ethics. And also, there is a high reward for people to advance quickly and get a great job. There is a deficit to spending time thinking about ethical issues and saying, wait, we should slow down and not do that. That doesn't lead to profits for a company, right? You're not going to necessarily get awards or promotions or high grades for that unless it's really part of a course. So we're not economically incentivizing thinking about ethics. And I wonder if something needs to happen, not that these things can be promulgated or written into, legislation and regulations, but there's a similar problem with climate change. There's just no incentive to adopt cleaner energies until you start thinking about carbon tax. Now you've changed the economic balance and now it's more likely to happen. So, where's the ethics tax? Where's the driver that's going to make people stop and think, maybe we should release this software in Q2 and not Q1, because, we haven't fully tested it, and yeah, it will work, but how well is it going to work for the visually impaired? How well is it going to work, for those controllers that are maybe accessible via the internet and switch railroad tracks? How well is it going to work? Whatever the scenarios are. We don't have an economic system really that favors ethics. And so you get a society and the up and coming in the society, the kids who say, it's not on the test. Why should I learn it?
Yeah, that idea of the ethics tax, like some sort of incentive structure to really motivate people to pay attention. Yeah, it's something I think engineering ethics in particular, more broadly, has struggled with for a long time. I was thinking about the podcast, and Peter Milliken, the host, who's a philosopher at Oxford, had this really interesting moment at the end in the Q&A with the first speaker, who was I don't remember his role, but from MIT in computer science. Milliken said, so this guy was talking about, skills versus teaching philosophy, ethics as a philosophy, teaching as a skill instead. And Milliken said at one point, that makes sense to me. This would then motivate an interest in ethics, right? And I thought that was a really subtle way of saying you're misrepresenting what ethics is from a philosopher, right? You're misrepresenting what ethics is. You don't teach it as a skill. You use skills to motivate interest in ethics. And so Milliken was making this distinction in kind, and the speaker was just like, yeah, sure, I guess so. But that got me thinking, this conversation is happening at all kinds of levels. The podcast speakers were thinking about the approach. We're thinking about the problem of like curricular or training space, and also the problem of expertise, and all of those go together in some sort of amalgam. Ethics tax, yeah, I like it.
So I'm curious about that. For you, Jonathan, or whomever else might have any thoughts about that, but this idea of motivating ethical action, creating dispositions. It almost seemed like an intellectual / moral virtue based approach that the speaker was advocating for, but the way to approach this was more skills based, kind of, habituate people to have those skills so they think about ethics in their daily, practices in terms of, okay, how do I build this software? I start by doing something and then I pause and think about, okay, what can that lead to? Kind of embed it within a person. And that makes sense to a good extent to me. But there is, to that point raised by the moderator, there is some force in ethical arguments and ethical theory that really motivates you, or at least motivated me, and I assume many of us here, to really pay attention to ethical arguments as really binding and having to, inform the way we do things in life. And I wonder, what are we sacrificing when we're embracing this very practical approach in terms of, okay, you put these methods within the way that you do things, within the way that you engineer, within the way that you create software. When this motivation is just habituation and not something intrinsically, driving a person to really care about the implications of what they do. And the reason why I'm thinking about the importance of really creating this drive is because these industries, especially tech, but every industry really that's technologically based these days, just advance so fast. And so teaching methods on the one hand is good, but methods change, the ways of doing things, technologies change. Some principles, no doubt, remain the same, but it seems like we need people who are adaptable and people who have, embedded ethical dispositions that no matter what, this will be part of the calculus for them. So yeah, I'm a bit skeptical as to the skills approach. As much as I love it and it seems very, elegant as a way to resolve the problem, I'm wondering if it's sufficient to motivate people in the long run and, at a larger scale.
Yeah, I'm wanting here, Alex, to bastardize Aristotle and the rhetoricians, because I feel like it's a real old problem. A lot of what's happening, even in this podcast, is that we're developing a critique of like the logos approach to teaching ethics. We're like, we teach the normative theories and the reasoning approaches, and that's, as Jason said, is very different from what normally happens in a computer science curriculum, and that's at the expense of the ethos and the pathos. And the Aristotelian model is that all three of those things have to happen together. You need the expertise, that's the logos part. You need the ethos part, that's the culture of the training and the integration and the embeddedness you've talked about. And then you need the approach, and that's what the podcast was about, the pathos. Like Jason's example of storytelling is part of that pathos. Like, what's the approach you use to cultivate engagement? But you can't do that without ethos and logos as well. And I feel like we tend to take these one little buckets of ethics and we're like, we're going to talk today about ethical decision making, and it's the reason bit, right? But without that whole package, again, it's like an ancient idea, but the whole package is necessary, is sufficient, and each piece is necessary.
Steve, you have thoughts?
Just as an aside, I would think bringing ethics into computer science ought to be the easiest ask, much easier than other disciplines, because you have the case study, in Asimov's sci-fi literature of the positronic brain and the 3 laws of robotics. And I think I've said that before in these kind of meetings, so I could just be too much of a sci-fi geek. But it seems like that's a way to kind of bring in the thought experiment and also bring in what I see as the real conundrum with ethics and teaching ethics. I'm hung up on this notion, and because I'm an imposter ethicist, I won't articulate it very well. But I'm hung up on this notion that ethics fundamentally is about navigating conflicting values and views, and then having recognition of that and awareness of that to make better decisions. Because if it was just one person and their product, only affected them and there were no other people in the world, I don't even know if it'd be an ethical issue to wrestle with, right? But it's where impacts of one person's decision can affect another's, and further where different people have different values, and put different weighting on how we should treat certain things. That's where we end up having some complicated conversations and dilemmas and things like that that fit squarely within the domain of ethics. So it seems to me like when we talk about teaching ethics, a lot of people may feel that it's, you know, a set of simple principles that you can outline that everyone will universally agree to. And if it were that simple, then we wouldn't have, you know, screw ups so much. We wouldn't have complications where, you know, one person thinks that Ford's handling of the light bulb in the, or the rear tail light, you know, in their automobile causing explosions on rear end impacts, that the way they handled it was bad, and others might say, well, no, it was good, only a few were affected. You know, you will have differences of opinion on things like that. So I really think that even our approach to the notion of teaching ethics is weighted in the sense that we think of it as principles that are teachable in the sense that we'd all, they're universal truths, so we'd all agree to them. And I don't think it is. I think the more complex issues out there are the ones where you get differences of opinion, and those especially occur with new issues, things that technology brings to the fore, where you have new technological capabilities. It changes that ethics landscape. It takes a while for people to realize all of the downstream impacts and the pros and the cons and the coulda, shoulda, wouldas, until we eventually converge to, you know, now we need IRB approvals, or, you know, now we need FDA approvals. So ethics to me is in some ways a different kind of teaching. That maybe comes back maybe to Ian's comment earlier, that it's probably different from teaching titrations in chemistry. You know, there's a set way to do it. So it's a very different thing to think about teaching. Just Josh is next.
Josh, you're muted.
Yeah, I was muted. Sorry. Yeah, I have some things to say that came from before what Steve said, but I think since Steve just said it, I think at least as far, I have this dream, right, that we'll figure out ethics and it is clear and everyone accepts it. That I'm still such a moral realist about this, that I think there may be some far off possible future, maybe only sci-fi though. But I think at least in the meantime, I think Steve's right. Like, even if we are all very skilled, committed ethicists, we're going to have different opinions about whether, you know, Ford should recall this light, should they bring all the, you know, whatever. And so I think that point plus this sort of, and this I'm connecting to the earlier point. There's always thought I had, like, oh, we're thinking, okay, should we teach ethics this way? Is it going to reach these 20% of students? Do we want to force compliance? Blah, blah, blah. I think it often, especially when I finally get myself out of the theoretical thing. I mean, presumably we're going to have to be doing all these things, right? Like, so some things are going to have to just be compliance regulations, and we're going to want to make sure those are as effective as possible. And of course, some people, the incentives are going to be such that they just check the boxes. But if this has some payoff in the end by reducing harm X amount, you know, so IACUCs probably reduce the amount of animals that are abused, but probably not as much as like you would want it to, because some people know how to frame the wording in the right way to get the experiment, you know, or accepted. But then I think once we, at least for me, once I remember that, of course, not one path, one way of teaching ethics or one commitment to top-down compliance stuff versus bottom-up ethics stuff is going to solve it all. I think it makes it a little less like, we don't actually have to resolve, is this the mode of teaching ethics, if we can try some of this mode and some of that mode and some of that mode. Especially when we know, even if we thought one of these was the best way, we're going to get the problem that Steve's bringing out, which is like, look, in the end, 100% perfectly educated Steve and 100% perfectly educated Jonathan might have a different opinion on this because their evaluation of the situation is going to come out differently. And so where was I had a punchline, I had a take home thing, and that's gone. So now you're just in my mind. Maybe someone else will remember my punchline. But I guess the resum is just that I think we don't have to be committed to thinking there's a single means or method that's the way to go here. And I think I often get tempted into thinking that's what I need to do. I need to resolve what's the very best, and that very best must work for everyone. And then I'm like, well, actually, that's, of course, top-down regulation is great to force the 20% to follow the law or follow the compliances we want. But of course, a big top down fails because the technology moves too fast, and so we actually need the engineer in that moment to think, oh, there's something something going wrong here that maybe the regulation's not capturing. But I guess we can have both, I guess. Sorry about the rambling. Jason,
Oh, no,
help me.
not at all. This also made me think, Josh, real fast about, maybe we cannot have these universal principles, but perhaps to Ian's point from early on, there is something to teach about, what kinds of disagreements are within reason and which ones are not, right? So at least set some parameters for conversation. But Jason, you have a point.
Yeah, I have 2 points. One is about skills, like you mentioned, and the other is about Joshua's point about teaching it. I wonder too, as a club, we often just use the word ethics, but I wonder if you can secretly teach ethics without having to use the word ethics, which may be a turnoff to non-philosophy folks. Like, what does it mean to think ethically in the first place, and just really focusing on that and not necessarily having to be so obvious about it. I wonder how that could help that 20% not be turned off from it for whatever reason. For example, like critical reasoning, or using your imagination to imagine the scenarios that can happen when you build an algorithm or a software a certain way, right? As engineers, we often have to think of edge cases and corner cases of where the program could fail. Why not just, we can extend that kind of simply to how could this which cases of the program may impact a user of these different personas. One with disabilities, one that English isn't their primary language. That maybe is easier to chew, and is actually common practice with like user experience design today in those classes that some students have to take, but not all have to take. They're often electives. So I do think a human-centered approach in all our computer science classes would be really helpful as another type of case worth considering for program correctness, instead of thinking of it as a separate thing, that it's just like that's a different world. So I believe, yeah, with integrating that. So what I'm trying to say is let's boil it down to the specifics when we want to educate them on what they need to improve. So like I said, critical reasoning. The other thing about skills, I guess is the same thing, right? So we're trying to teach skills about like critical reasoning, right? And using thought experiments perhaps is really useful. And I wonder though, like the problem I think with CS especially is why are there so many? Well, it's such a popular major. A lot of students in my generation and younger, we know if we could become a software engineer, we'll just make a ton of money and we'll finally be comfortable and safe. That's like the objective. And I think so to meet that objective, it's about meeting the requirements for an interview at the companies you want to work at. In those interviews and those job postings, what skills do they say are only technical, some are social. The social skills are just you communicate well across cross-functional teams. It's not you critically analyze the possible outcomes of your software and technologies, right? So I'm already disincentivized from paying attention to skills I don't need to get the jobs I want to have. I think that ties back to my original point of seeing engineers in real companies talk about how they use these skills and that those skills are actually essential to the role. That would be more powerful to me. And actually, I would love to see job descriptions talk about that more often, if that is actually important to them. Because then students would learn, oh, I'm going to be asked this in an interview. So sort of tying the two to their own they have a personal stake in learning it, because if they want to achieve their goals, they in fact need to have honed these skills. So yeah, I think skills, and not talking about ethics, but talking about, focusing on skills, not on the concept of ethics, may help all CS students there.
with some bias, Jason. I think I agree with you 90% of the time, but I think the place of expertise is still really important in those fringe cases of novel experiences. Because if we rely on examples and cases, what we're relying on are shared intuitions, and most of the time those are good guides for us, right? So, but in the case of a novel problem, like you've got to have some, I think you've got to have some bigger framing of the scope of ethics and how to deliberate about values and their conflicts and their tensions. And I don't think those come as readily from our intuitions. But maybe again, I've got significant bias there.
Yeah. Perhaps it'd be beneficial for those of us CS folks already ethically inclined, very passionate about it. The training would be helpful, right? To get those frameworks, the mental model, to then relate to our own experiences. So I do think a partnership is definitely warranted there.
Yeah, this I think is well, we're at time, so I guess we can leave it there, but I think this is really a really interesting point. I think that to some extent, while I agree fully with Jonathan that there is an important role for expertise, and there is, at least the way I understand ethics, professional ethicists or philosophers do really detailed work that sometimes is really necessary, and things are not as easy to decipher always in a class where you're reading a case study. But I think in many ways the language of ethics does almost create an artificial barrier, because if ethics was truly integrated into everything, then we wouldn't even necessarily need to be talking about ethical engineering, right? It would be fitting to be an engineer, you would need to be ethical, period. The same way you need to be technical and well versed in technologies and all sorts of other things, and be really a good engineer, right? It would be baked into what a good engineer is. And this kind of connects to the point that Dr. Kubler was making about bringing the people from the industry as well to be the models, in addition to just having professors who, while insiders, might also be perceived a bit as outsiders, as a barrier before the entry into the profession. And I really like that point that you made, Jason, about seeing job calls that actually have a required qualification, that an analytic skill in thinking about these ethical dilemmas that arise often in one's work. But yeah, are there any final thoughts before we end today's discussion? Okay, then. Well, thank you all for being here. This was really, really fun, really interesting. This session ends our transition from the previous semester of AI in ethics, or ethics in AI rather, to this semester's more higher education focus. So we will start talking about issues that are of high salience to higher education ethics, that are beyond AI, from next session. So I hope you can make it to that as well. And I look forward to our future conversations.
That's good.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.